Today we'll be looking at Messianic prophecies that occur in the book of Psalms. And we're transitioning from our study of 2 Samuel chapter 7. Remember that was the Davidic covenant, the promise God made with David that one of his seed would sit on the throne forever. It was a promise that God would establish the kingdom or the dynasty of David forever. We said that there were two aspects of that promise. And this is what I think is a rare case in the Bible of what we might call dual fulfillment or double fulfillment, where there is obviously a short-term fulfillment of the passage, but then the Bible itself points to a further fulfillment, a distant future fulfillment. And we saw that where the text in 2 Samuel chapter 7 said that he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, and I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. And we saw that is quoted in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 5. But we also noted that we cannot view that text as completely messianic or only messianic, because there was a nearer fulfillment of the son of David who would build the temple, namely Solomon. That's explained, I think, a little bit further there in verse 14 of 2 Samuel 7, when it said, he will be a son to me, and when he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men, but my loving kindness shall not depart from him as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. So here it's clear that even if David's son, Solomon, becomes unfaithful, or if his descendants become unfaithful, God's promises to David are assured. We talked a little bit about the difference between the different kinds of covenants. The covenant to Abraham was in many ways a personal covenant. It was not going to be canceled out by any deeds of unfaithfulness by future generations. God promised Abraham that through him and then through his seed all families of the earth would be blessed. The promise to David is similar. God establishes that he will establish the line of David, the throne of David forever. And even if his son commits iniquity, God still will be faithful to his promise to David. Contrast that with what we call the Mosaic covenant, which was not a covenant with Moses personally, but rather a covenant with the nation. And that covenant could be broken, and the blessings of that covenant could be rescinded. We see that in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, for example. Down in verse 16, the promise continued in 2 Samuel 7, your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. We said that me is probably the best reading there, following the Greek Septuagint in that text. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, there's no escaping Solomon's role in this prophecy, and we can turn to places like 1 Chronicles 28, where when David reiterates the promise, he makes it very clear that Solomon is at least the initial fulfillment of the promise of a son who would build the temple. And 1 Chronicles 28 documents that clearly for us. On the other hand, within the passage itself, there is language that suggests a broader and a longer future fulfillment. Just the phrase, your throne shall be established forever. Well, now who's going to sit on that throne? And then later on, when David reflects upon the significance of what God has promised him and recognizes the grace that God has showed him, down in verse 19 of 2 Samuel 7, he says, you have spoken also of the house of thy servant concerning the distant future. David recognized that this promise carried down far reaches of time. And so there's good reason for us, in light of that and what the New Testament tells us, to see this in a messianic sense. Now, as we come to the book of Psalms, let's recognize that this promise to David is very clearly lined out in several texts there. Probably the most important passage for seeing the continuity from the covenant of David in 2 Samuel 7 would be Psalm 89. And we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at Psalm 89. there are certain messianic elements here as they connect to the promise to David. But I'm reading Psalm 89 in verses 3 and 4. I have made a covenant with David, with my chosen one, David my servant. I will establish your seed forever, and I will build up your throne to all generations. This is a rehashing of the promises God made to David. Or if we drop down to verse 20, God speaking, I have found David, my servant, and with my holy oil I have anointed him, with whom my hand will be established, and my arm will strengthen him. We come down to verse 29, I will establish his descendants forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. The word descendants is one way to translate the word zerah, or seed. We could translate it, I will establish his seed forever. Some translations, like the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Old Testament, often renders this with the word line. I will establish his line forever. And then in verses 30 and following, we see a slightly different rendering of the promise, whereas in 2 Samuel 7 it referred to the iniquity of his son, singular. Here it's sons, plural, which shows the scope of the concept of seed, the descendants. In Psalm 89:30, if his sons forsake my law and do not walk in my judgments, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will visit their transgression with the rod and their iniquity with stripes. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, that is David, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His descendants, his seed, his line shall endure forever. His throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful. So the permanence, the enduring nature of David's kingdom is again reinforced here in Psalm 89 for us. Now, as we look at the different psalms that we'll be treating here now in these next several sessions, let's say just a word about the scope of the book of Psalms and some of the things that we can expect in this book. First of all, the book of Psalms, extremely important book, 116 citations from the book of Psalms in the New Testament. Now, there's a total of about 283. So when you look at that ratio, 116 out of 283, you're seeing what roughly maybe 40% of the citations from the Old Testament are from the book of Psalms. One would expect then that the book of Psalms has something to say about Christ's coming. We could also point out that out of the 150 Psalms, 73 of them are directly attributed to David. The authorship is referred to in the psalm headings, the psalm titles. Be careful in your Bibles to distinguish between what are the original Hebrew psalm headings and sometimes psalm headings that are supplied by our translators. Not all of the psalms have psalm headings. Roughly 50 of the psalms are anonymous. Out of the 73 psalms that are attributed to David, the vast majority of those occur in roughly the first half of the book of Psalms, from Psalm 1 through Psalm 72. However, we have to recognize that some of the psalms that we call anonymous, or what some would call the orphan psalms, are also probably written by David. Our first psalm for study here in a minute, Psalm chapter 2, is indeed one of these psalms that is not attributed to David in the book of Psalms. It's an anonymous psalm, but in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 4, verse 25, Psalm 2 is credited to David. It was by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit through the mouth of the prophet David. And so we can add that one to the ledger on David's side. So we could say with certainty that about half of the Psalms were written by David, And it's many of these psalms that we are concerned about here as we think about the promises concerning the Messiah. If indeed God's promises to David would be fulfilled in the distant future, we would expect to see some of David's language in the Psalms reflecting that very promise in light of what we've seen here in 2 Samuel chapter 7. There are other things we could say about the book of Psalms. We can date the Psalms, you see, not only from the time of David, around 1000 B.C., but the earliest psalm, we have a single psalm, Psalm 90, that's attributed to Moses. And then we could go to, for example, Psalm 137, which is a psalm dating from the exile, so maybe around 550 B.C. Nothing really that clearly datable after that. So we have roughly, if we go from 1400 B.C. to around 550 B.C., roughly about an 850-year period. Some Old Testament scholars, critical scholars, have tried to date some of the Psalms centuries after that, even down maybe to the time of the 2nd century B.C. and the time of the Maccabees and the political turmoil that occurred then. But there's really no good evidence for that. One of the evidences for the antiquity of the psalm headings, which are disputed by some as being original, I would argue they are certainly very early, if not original, to the initial writing of the psalm. We see in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, when these psalm titles are translated, that there were certain technical terms in the psalm titles that the Jewish translators in 200 or 250 B.C. did not understand. Those terms had already lost their meaning in the language, and they were not exactly sure what some of those musical titles referred to. And one phrase in particular we find throughout the psalm titles is something like "for the choir director" or "to the director of music." And that phrase in the Septuagint is translated "unto the end" or "forever." And so they really did not understand the significance, the meaning of that particular term. And if the Septuagint translators did not understand the psalm titles, that suggests to me that those psalm titles had been around for quite a while. Well, I think now we can go ahead and begin our looking at specific psalms, and we're going to start here now with Psalm chapter 2. First thing we can say about Psalm chapter 2 is that we could categorize it as a royal psalm. A royal psalm has to do with aspects of the throne, the kingly family, the palace, the dynasty, anything that relates to the life and anything connected with the king, we would call a royal psalm. It's very obvious once we read the text, look through it, to see how this would be identified as a royal psalm. The real question for us is, though, to identify the anointed king that is described here in this passage. Now, I said earlier that many of the uses of Mashiach, the word Messiah in the Old Testament, really don't have direct reference to the Messiah. It was used of prophets, priests, kings, and even Cyrus, a pagan king. Only a handful, and maybe a partial handful, of actual references in the Old Testament directly relate to Jesus as the Messiah fulfilling these prophecies. And so I think we have to at least recognize that the term Messiah came to have greater significance in the later history of the Jewish nation. But I would suggest that in Psalm 2 we indeed have an example here of the term Mashiach, anointed one, as directly relating to the Messiah, when it says that the rulers take their stand against Yahweh, against the Lord, and against His Messiah, His anointed one. And so this would be one of those cases where the word Messiah does refer to Christ here in the Old Testament in a very specific way. To get to the identity of the anointed king, let's briefly look at the passage, and let's make some comments here about how to interpret the text. And I think the key text is verse 7, and we'll have to look at that, give that some special attention here, and then just say a few things about the entire psalm and its status as being messianic. We read, I'm reading the New American Standard Bible, "Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." Direct quote from these kings. Look for those in the text of poetry. Sometimes it's not always clear who the speaker is. Verse 4, "He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. Then He will speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His fury." The resistance of these kings is almost humorous. "As for me," God is speaking, "I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." And now note the quotation marks at verse 7, because we now have a change in speaker. Yahweh has spoken about installing His king on the throne, but now the installed king is speaking. "I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord, of Yahweh. He said to me, 'Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee.'" The NIV would read, "Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as thy inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, and shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son." We'll come back to that phrase. "Lest He become angry and you perish in the way. For His wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in Him." As we think about the identity of the anointed king, we can simply note, first of all, that this passage, "Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee," is quoted there in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5, along with the verse in 2 Samuel 7:14. So there's a connection there. Also in chapter 5 of Hebrews and verse 5. So the book of Hebrews shows that the begotten Son, or the one for whom God has become a Father, is in fact the Messiah, is Christ. Now there's more to this psalm, however, as far as citation in the New Testament. For example, we have a reference in Acts 4:25 to the beginning of Psalm 2, which has to do with the kings of the earth in rebellion against the Messiah. And that's quoted there in reference to Pilate and the Romans and the Jewish leaders and how they sought to destroy Christ. And so that historical incident is viewed as a fulfilling of this imagery of rebellion at the beginning of Psalm 2. As well, we have language that relates to the book of Revelation, there in verse 9 of Psalm 2. Revelation chapter 2, verse 37, talks about ruling with a rod of iron, and it looks to be one of the very few direct quotes from the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. That's kind of remarkable. The book of Revelation is full of Old Testament imagery, language, concepts, a lot of specific wording. You can't escape it. The book of Isaiah permeates the book of Revelation. But if a careful analysis shows that there are only maybe one or two direct citations of any length, 4 or 5 words, let's say, from the Old Testament, and they're from the Greek Septuagint. But this is one of the very rare quotations from the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, and it has to do with the reign of Christ, our eternal King. So we see messianic citation all the way from the first verse down through the 9th verse. I guess that might answer the question at the bottom of the page relating to, is the entire psalm messianic? We have good reason, I think, to view everything in this psalm as directly relating to the coming of the Messiah. Now let's focus just for a moment on the language in verse 7. I call it the ascension formula. We've already listed the various Messianic citations there, interpreting it from the New Testament. The ascension formula, the speaker is the anointed one, the begotten one, if you would, the Son whom God places on the throne. And the question that I often ask students is, when is the Son begotten of the Father? And rarely do I get the answer I'm looking for, partly because it's often viewed from a New Testament perspective, and the exact context of this psalm is ignored. Clearly, there's a sense in which Christ is begotten from eternity. The church councils wrestled with the nature of Jesus, his eternality, and the controversy between the Arians and the Athanasians dealing with the whole issue of Christ's eternality and coexistence with the Father. And although they gave an answer to that, which we have followed, I think, through history, that Christ is co-eternal, Son and the Father, still the way they got to that probably was not all that satisfactory, and certainly has raised problems. Cults like the Jehovah's Witnesses have questioned some of that language and have denied that Jesus is eternal. I think it's correct to say that Christ is begotten from all eternity in a sense, that he has always existed. And one could argue that he was begotten at Bethlehem, thinking of the incarnation, when God became flesh, dwelt among us. John chapter 1 we read, the Word became flesh, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But in this particular passage, by context, we're not talking about the birth of Christ, nor are we talking about the eternal existence of Christ. Rather, I would contend that the begetting here, the point at which God became a father to the Son in a very special, unique way, was at the resurrection. So we need to look at another key text in the New Testament, and that's in the book of Acts, and that's Acts chapter 13. Acts 13:33 is the key verse there. And again, the promises to David are emphasized here by Paul in this chapter. And we'll pick it up there. Verse 26 talks about brethren, sons of Abraham's family. So reminding us of the promises to Abraham. Speaks about Christ being put to death by the authority of Pilate, there in verse 28. It says that it was carried out, all that was written concerning him, and they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb, but God raised him from the dead. Verse 32 says, we preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers, that God has fulfilled this promise to our children in that he raised up Jesus, as it is also written in the second psalm, thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. And then connecting also with a further promise there in Acts, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, speaking about the holy and sure blessings of David. And then connecting directly there with Psalm 16, where the passage, you will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay, where David, Paul says, David is not talking about himself, but is talking about the one whom God raised, who did not undergo decay. So Psalm 2 is in the middle of all of this, and it's clear that the being raised up, what I would say the resurrection and ascension, raised to sit on the throne with God, that is a fulfillment of Psalm chapter 2. And by the way, Psalm 2 is the only chapter quoted by chapter from the Old Testament in the entire New Testament. In the first century, the Old Testament books were not divided up into chapters. The only book that was the book of Psalms. And so Psalm 2 will be the only chapter number from the Old Testament that you'll read in the Bible. And so in Psalm 2, God raised up Jesus, fulfilling here the language of Psalm 2. You are my son, today I have begotten you. I call this a royal begetting. Jesus is now a son in a special, unique way. In ancient times, kings had many sons, but only one son was the heir. And I would recall what Paul writes in Romans chapter 1. When he talks about the apostleship, the gospel of God, chapter 1, verse 2, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and who was declared with power to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord. That gets at what I'm talking about here. Christ at the resurrection becomes a son in a unique new way. He is declared by God with power to be His Son. And so the ascension formula relates to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Just a final word about the language in verse 12. Translations differ on how to render this, but literally it seems to read, worship the Lord with reverence. And then in verse 12, kiss the Son. Some translations say, do homage to the Son. One translation, the Revised Standard Version, says, kiss His feet. That would have been probably an act of homage to a king, to kiss the feet. The Septuagint didn't exactly know what to do with it, and it read something like, accept correction. One of the problems with the language, not only the problem of kiss, which I think we can understand in terms of homage, is that the word son is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. The word son in Hebrew is ben. Here the word is bar. And it's becoming clearer that there are a number of Aramaic words in the Old Testament. It's not an evidence of late date at all. Aramaic and Hebrew coexisted, much like English coexists with Spanish and French and German, and words can filter in from one language to the next. And so for some reason we find occasional Aramaisms in the Old Testament. An alternative suggestion is to take the word bar and render it something like pure or chosen. Choose the pure one or the chosen one. That would make it more Hebrew, but probably doesn't reflect exactly what most people think the text has to say. Well, that's our look at Psalm 2. It's a royal psalm, and I think it's a great way to introduce our look at the Psalms as they pertain to the promises concerning the Messiah.